Hi, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Josh.
Today we have to create a ripoff of Crash Course so we can get good grades on our...
To educate the viewers.
Uh-huh. Anyways, here's our Crash Course on Vietnam, Ripoff Edition.
The purpose of the Vietnam War was to keep South Vietnam from falling from the communist North Vietnam, who were backed by allies such as the Soviet Union and China, who were also both communists. Also, during the early years of the Vietnam struggle, the South Vietnamese leader, Diem, was becoming very unpopular with his subjects, as more and more countrymen were turning against him until he was eventually assassinated. Now, let's set the role for the American involvement. During the early 1960s, the Vietnam War wasn't that big of an issue. However, once President Kennedy was elected, he adopted Eisenhower's theory that if communist forces were to overthrow South Vietnam, then it could possibly spread to other parts of Eastern Asia. Keeping this theory in mind, Kennedy would send aid to southern Vietnam, who would train them and provide them with weapons and facilities. By 1963, there were around 16,000 U.S. soldiers in South Vietnam. However, their role was support, not combat.
It wasn't until an incident that occurred in the Tonkin Gulf that gave President Johnson a reason to go to Congress for authorization for U.S. forces to go into combat. According to Johnson, northern Vietnamese ships had opened fire on U.S. naval ships. The president used this as an opportunity to convince Congress to declare war, as he believed it was a sufficient reason for military retaliation. Congress approved, giving the president or the commander-in-chief a blank check to protect the U.S. interests in Vietnam. This was known as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. In later years, critics had considered that Vietnam was an illegal war because the war was not declared by Congress.
By 1965, the war began to escalate. After the Viet Cong attacked a U.S. base, Johnson authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, which was an air attack using B-52 bombers against North Vietnam. In April of that same year, combat troops were used for the first time to fight the Viet Cong. By the end of the year, there were over 184,000 U.S. troops in southern Vietnam, using search and destroy tactics and all in combat role. By the end of 1967, the number escalated to 485,000 troops in Vietnam, and the peak even got to 540,000 in 1969, and by this time, 16,000 Americans had already died in the conflict. Because the war escalated, the economy also improved, as in the early 1960s there were high levels of unemployment, and there were also idle plants that could be used if there was a rising demand for production. As a result of this economic stimulation, more jobs were created as well in the military field.
In January 1968, the Viet Cong launched an all-out attack on American-occupied bases and capitals in South Vietnam. This event was known as the Tet Offensive. The U.S. retaliated, with the Viet Cong having greater losses than the U.S., who also reclaimed lost territory. The U.S. victory was interpreted differently in a more negative way by people back home, causing a considerable setback for Johnson's Vietnam policy.
The Tet Offensive was considered to be a major turning point during the war, as this was the period where U.S. involvement in Vietnam began to be the center of mass criticism. See, there were two types of people. You had the supporters of the war, or Hocs, who believed that North Vietnamese were allied with the Soviets as a part of a plan to conquer all of Southeast Asia. Then you had the opposers of the war, or the Doves, who felt that the conflict was just a civil war fought by nationalists and communists who wanted to overthrow the corrupt Saigon government of southern Vietnam. Protests toward the war also began to skyrocket around this time, a large group being college students. They protested because as soon as they graduated, they were subject to being drafted in the war. Let's take a look at one of the flyers that was handed out at Michigan State University during the Vietnam War to protest. This is from March 18, 1969, Anti-War Basic Training Day. Now that the politicians are safely past the elections and the Paris peace talks have been proven the farce that they are, the draft calls are being raised higher and higher. If you are about to graduate from high school, college, or grad school, you are probably expecting a letter from your draft board. If you are a GI or if you expect to be drafted soon, come and learn things you need to know what the brass won't teach you. The program will include reports and discussions from active duty GIs and Vietnam veterans on their experience in the armed services, official U.S. Army Army indoctrination films, workshops and discussions on how to put on an underground newspaper for a base, discussions on what GI rights and how they can be legally exercised, and reports from lawyers familiar with military law. Included in the program will be short histories of the Vietnam War and of the Going Home movement organized by soldiers after World War II. Others protested due to the cost of money and American lives that were being lost. People felt that rather than put more money toward the Vietnam War, the money should be put toward domestic issues.
Tet was responded to by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, requesting 200,000 more troops to win the war. By this time, however, Cold War diplomats who sided with President Johnson previously turned on him and any further ideas of further escalating the war. In March of 1968, President Johnson, being on television, told the American people he would limit the bombing of North Vietnam and negotiate peace. He also stated he wouldn't be running for president again, most likely due to the massive backlash he received from the Tet Offensive. In May of 1968, peace talks between North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the U.S. began in Paris, but were quickly disregarded over minor issues.
In 1968, Richard Nixon had defeated George Wallace in the presidential election. During his campaign, he used the slogans "Peace with Honor" and "Law and Order" as his stance was a hawk. In actuality, after Nixon was elected, his primary goal was to reduce the number of troops out in Vietnam, but avoiding the appearance of U.S. defeat as well. Nixon began the process of Vietnamization, which gradually removed troops from Vietnam and gave South Vietnam the weapons, training, and money they would need to conduct the war on their own. The Nixon Doctrine was also later passed, which stated that Asian allies would receive support from the U.S., but without ground forces. Protests gradually lessened after these events occurred. However, it was discovered that he had escalated the war in 1970 by attacking Vietnamese bases in Cambodia. This led to the infamous Kent State and Jackson State shootings, which created national uproar. In reaction to these events, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed by only the Senate. The Pentagon Papers were also released, exposing the government of its mistakes that were made by policymakers during the war.
The question is, was the Vietnam War worth it? Despite our war on communism, our economic status and morale were greatly impacted in a negative manner. The amount of deficient spending caused the national debt to increase. Also, if the billions of dollars weren't spent on the Vietnam War and rather on domestic issues, then the country would have probably been better off financially and socially. The nonviolent protesters were successfully able to inform the government that investing their time and money into Vietnam was a mistake. After we withdrew from the war, South Vietnam eventually fell to North Vietnam after being weakened over a large span of time. No wonder people see this war as a loss for us.
And there you have it, viewers. That is our crash course ripoff of Vietnam. Aaron, what'd you think? A+ material?
Maybe A-, B+. But Josh, you're forgetting something. It's not all about grades. It's about the value. It's about being enriched with knowledge that you can keep for a lifetime. It's about prospering what you've learned and cherishing it for the rest of your life. Think about it, Josh.
No, I'm pretty sure it's about the grade.
Yeah, you're right. Anyways, people, thanks for watching Crash Course Ripoff. Oh, is it over?
Yep.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah, we're gonna get an A+ on this piece of shit.